when you make some 24/7 surveillance, which is quite basic. With AI and drones, you can do it without putting a frigate in the middle of the islands of the Baltic, for example. I think we concentrated during the post-Cold War all the stuff on single platforms. Today we diversify the number of platforms, the missions, and so you see the drones are able to have an exquisite payload to do a certain mission that will help the big platforms to do it better or to be at the good place and to be more resilient, more performant, and more lethal.
From Friends of Europe, this is Policy Voices. I'm Catarina Villanova. Today on the show, I'm bringing you a very special guest. In June, Admiral Pierre Vandier became NATO's new Supreme Allied Commander transformation. A few days ago, Admiral Vandier came to Friends of Europe for a conversation with our senior fellow, Jamie Shea. Jamie is also the former Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO. In this conversation, Jamie asks the Admiral about the role of Supreme Allied Commander transformation and what exactly transformation means nowadays. And of course, about the war in Ukraine. Here's Jamie Shea speaking with Admiral Pierre Vandier.
We usually have a special guest, and that is certainly the case today. A very special guest. We have the Admiral Pierre Vandier, who last June became the new Supreme Allied Commander transformation in the NATO alliance. This is one of the three most senior NATO commander positions, the others being the chairman of the military committee and the Supreme Allied Commander Europe. So we have somebody who really has an excellent oversight into all of the current issues facing both the alliance in Europe when it comes to security and defense. Allied Command Transformation is one of the NATO commands which is not based in Europe, unlike so many of the others. It's in Norfolk, Virginia. So it has a special role, not only in helping NATO to transform, but also in preserving a close link between what's happening in North America and what's happening in Europe. And I will ask Admiral Vandier in just a moment how his command is preserving that transatlantic link. But let me simply say that when he got the position, he had the ideal CV, having been a commander, both flying naval aviation, but also a commander of the Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier, so operational experience, and lots of policy-making political positions as the military chef de cabinet of the French defense minister, chief of the French Navy, and more recently, before moving to NATO, the vice chief of defense of France. So thank you very much, Mon Amiral, for being with us today. We're very, very honored, very pleased to have you. I know our listeners are going to be very interested in what you have to tell us. So you're in Brussels, sir, because of NATO foreign ministers were meeting yesterday and today. The meeting has just finished. Warm us up. Tell us a little bit what your impressions were of this particular meeting and its significance in terms of the current NATO agenda.
Bonjour, Jamie. Très heureux d'être ici. So very pleased to be on this podcast. So yes, 2 days of discussion on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs formats of the Council. And so main discussion, of course, about Ukraine and Russia. Perception of all members that we are in a long-term agenda with Russia. Discussing of the NATO-Russia Act, which is dying, in fact, due to the Russian action, and a lot of discussion about the globalization of the conflict with Iran, with RDPK, with China, which are involved in supporting Russia, and which implication drives a long-lasting conflict.
Admiral, could you perhaps also start our conversation by telling us a little bit about the role of Allied Command Transformation? Many people who look at NATO will have been familiar with the old shape, Allied Command Operations down at Mons in Belgium, set up in the early 50s with General Eisenhower and obviously being part of the alliance's history ever since. But Allied Command Transformation is a much more recent innovation. Transformation, of course, is a very general term. So why was this particular command established? What purpose does it serve? How do you see your own role when it comes to NATO, your relationship with the NATO command structure, with the SACEUR, and what your own sort of mission and priorities are?
So if we go back to history, since the beginning, there were two Supreme Allied Commanders. One was for Europe, lands, SACEUR, and we had SACLANS, which was a command for controlling the Atlantic. At the end of the Cold War, the use of this command was less clever, it was less useful. And so on the 9/11, when we had the terrorist attacks on the US, there was a sense of a need to change NATO to make these old Cold War armies be fitted for fighting against terrorism, expeditionary crisis management, all that kind of things. And so the decision of the alliance in 2003 was to shut down SACLANT and to open ACT, Allied Commander Transformation. And so it was a command given to the US since the beginning because it was in US soil, etc. And in fact, when Nicolas Sarkozy went back in the command structure of NATO on the edge of 2008, the negotiation went to give this big command to France. And so since this period, it's given to a French officer, the first non-aviator guy occupy this position. The former last US one was a very well-known officer because it was Jim Mattis. I met him in Washington 1 month ago to discuss about ACT. And so this discussion comes to your point. A lot of people say, what is ACT about? And so the discussion with Jim Mattis highlighted the fact that, in fact, we are necessary to NATO future. We are in a very fast-changing world where new technology, new geopolitical questions are to take into account. And so ACT is the military command that gives strategic foresight, which is at the core of the NATO capabilities building with the NDPP, the NATO Defense Planning Process. We are holding hand in hand with SECURE and with the ASG DPP, so plans and policy. And we are at the core of innovation, bringing some new stuff to NATO, and so giving this military advice about innovation.
That's very clear. But Admiral, at the same time, NATO has been using this word transformation for a long time, and sometimes conveying that it's a kind of permanent activity, une révolution permanente, as you might say in France. So a lot of things have already happened, of course, over the last few years. You mentioned the new challenges, the new NATO missions. How successful do you see NATO's transformation efforts so far? And I imagine if you are now occupying for the next few years the post of Supreme Allied Commander Transformation, it means that the job isn't finished. It continues. So could you give us a sense of what you think the positive contribution has been so far? But obviously, if it's une révolution permanente, what are going to be the sort of the next steps and new priorities in turning transformation into sort of concrete objectives?
So would transformation be a simple task? I think that would be solved by a working group. And so the good idea of the people that created ACT was that is a long-lasting effort. The efforts initially made to transform NATO to be expeditionary, that was made for Afghanistan and all the lessons learned around this conflict. In fact, the DNA of ACT is still there. And so we need to bring NATO the good foresight to deal with long-term threats. And we see that they are growing everywhere. What is transformation? Mainly, first, it's the NDPP. So to sum it up, we have SECURE that has made some plans. And we are back to the plans that we just put in a safe at the end of the Cold War. So he brought it again with NATO enlargement, new questions. And so he made these plans. And then the NDPP is the way to make these plans be applied in long term. And so that drives to discussion with the countries in order to give their capability targets, where each country says, I will provide NATO that kind of things that will make the plan work. And so we were working on this because, as you know, and perhaps your listeners don't know, warfighting is not a question of number of tanks or aircraft. It's more complex than this. It needs all the things that make, just as a wall, sort of cement. All the bricks are given by nations, but you need the cement coherence so that your wall has not holes everywhere and is tough and rigid enough. And so it's what we are making by bringing all this overview of what is needed to fill the plans. And so it's a big process which is running on cycle, permanently adapted. And we are in a very important moment because on the next summit in La Haye in June, the capability targets 25 are to be approved by the nations.
Thank you, Admiral. As you know, in the media, we've had lots of sort of war warnings from military commanders. senior politicians, the notion that Europe now, NATO has to be ready for war. Hopefully it's not going to happen. And being ready, of course, is part of deterrence and avoiding war, as we well know. But that, of course, has put the spotlight, particularly in my own community, in a think tank community, on the issue of how ready is NATO? And as your job, of course, is to get NATO ready for all scenarios, what do you think now NATO still has to do to be sort of fully ready? We have NATO forces in Central and Eastern Europe. We have all of these exercises going on nearly every week. We have all of the focus on defence industrial production and the need to ramp up stocks. Where do you think this effort really has to be at the moment?
So on a purely military aspect, readiness is a question being discussed between SACEUR and the shots and the nations. So it's the fight tonight question. AC team is much more on the fight tomorrow and fight the next week. And so we are providing the warfighters what they will need in the future from long term to tonight. And so it's where we need to think about the new tools NATO needs to fulfill its missions. The military concept of the alliance is defense and deter in the alliance. The question today is how we defend, so it's the fight tonight, but how we deter. And nobody in Europe wants war, and nobody. But so we know that whether an enemy or an adversary, which is very aggressive, which tests all the day, both the borders or the unity of the alliance, there is a big question, which is deterrence. Deterrence is a concept that applies on the adversary before it begins its action. And so in GDA, we need to find a good balance between defend and deter. And deter, whatever you think is, I'm not only speaking of nuclear, it's the way to wait on the adversary with a huge force, saying, okay, if you intend to attack me, the consequences will be very bad for you. And so it's, I would say, this strategic language and the tools which are coming with, which are to regen and to reappropriate, both on the political side and on the military side.
This is fascinating. And you recently gave an interesting interview to Politico where you sort of thought that maybe still within the alliance, when it comes to the transformation culture, there's too much bureaucracy. You said that there has to be responsible risk taking, and you seem to suggest that transformation is not just a sort of a mechanical process of defence planning, but it's more of a mindset. It's more of an organisational, institutional culture. Am I interpreting your thinking correctly, sir?
In fact, it's not an engineer job. In fact, it's a political job and it's a mental job, where you go forward and you see what kind of dilemmas or difficulties you may encounter and how you try to solve it. It needs time to do that. You know that the minimum length of armament program is around 10 years today. So between an idea and a capability which is delivered, available, is 10 years. Just look at aggression of Ukraine was in 2022. The first capabilities we'll have, the big ones that have been launched after the Ukraine aggression, will arrive 2032, 2033. We have a strong sense of urgency. We used to have a quite long and bureaucratic process where you ask the military what kind of capability you need. Then you go to run specifications. Then you sign a contract and you have the industry which is building this. And then you test it and you adopt it. So 10, 15 years. We need to have, in parallel of this, to compress the time to make where 15 years are needed, perhaps 10 years. But on parallel of this, we need to have short and rapid adoption process. And NATO is working on this. It's the idea to bring things that come from the commercial sector and, I would say, weaponize it in a matter of months or years. It's what we are doing today.
Admiral, you mentioned Ukraine, and again, lots of us in the think tank community looking at the war in Ukraine are thinking, what are the lessons here when it comes to the future shape of warfare? The Ukrainians have put up a very brave defense. They seem to have this capacity to innovate very quickly. Drones, for example, measure, countermeasure, 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 almost real time on the battlefield with drones and new technologies being tested. As one of NATO's senior military advisors, when you look at Ukraine, do you think this is a sort of a sui generis conflict, which is purely on its own terms, or do you think there are lots of things here that we in NATO need to be looking at because they could be relevant for the way in which we might have to defend or even fight in future?
In fact, in Ukraine, you see a mix between World War One and World War Three. You have trenches, bayonets. You have a very, very bad and bloody warfighting with artillery, which range has not changed since the World War One, 40 kilometers. And you have new tech, which is arriving. You have Starlink, you have drones, you have cyber, you have AI. And so these new things which arrive are not that good news. The idea of replacing tanks and bayonets or guns by, I would say, AI or drones is not what we see in Ukraine. In fact, these new things driving the war being quicker, so the speed of dealing with targets has steadily increased and more lethal. And more lethal for populations. You've seen these cities absolutely damaged, where when you begin to fight in a city, it will last during 1 month, and nothing is over there at the end. So you have that kind of mix with high tech and very low tech. Where the Europeans are in difficulty today is that the lack of the both. And so we are lacking of weapons, of ammunition, and so to the big stuff which is necessary to make the war. And we need to invest on the new tech, which is enablers, which is accelerating the intel loop, which is giving some more accurate targeting and more lethal results.
So you think in terms of NATO's own capability development, we have to sort of have a balance, if you like, between 1970 and 2050 in a way, in the sense of industries being asked to do sort of two things, develop sort of new state-of-the-art technologies, but at the same time have this big sort of in-depth, almost World War II surge production capability for 155 artillery shells or tanks or spare parts for vehicles. Is it going to be that question of having this balance between the old and the new, or do you really see, for example, things like tanks or big ships, I know you're an admiral, becoming obsolescent and being replaced ultimately by these sort of like drones or cyber weapon instruments, these wholly these new technologies? It must be a difficult sort of issue with trying to get that balance right.
I think at first, it's not a question of replacement, it's a question of cohabitation. In the air domain, we speak of a loyal wingman. It's where you use drones or other stuff to go in more risky missions or missions that do not require people on the air. So when you make some 24/7 surveillance, which is quite basic, with AI and drones, you can do it without putting a frigate in the middle of the islands of the Baltic, for example. I think we concentrated during the post-Cold War all the stuff on single platforms. Today we diversify the number of platforms, the missions, and so you see the drones are able to have an exquisite payload to do a certain mission that will help the big platforms to do it better or to be at the good place and to be more resilient, more performant, and more lethal.
When it comes to naval operations, you're of course an admiral. I know you've flown planes as well, but you've commanded ships. In Ukraine, of course, we've focused very much on the land war and air war and missile war. Of course, there's been a bit of a maritime dimension in the Black Sea, but NATO, of course, is a maritime alliance. The transatlantic link is a maritime link across the Atlantic Ocean, and NATO has strategic seas in the Baltic, in the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, of course. And if you don't mind, I know as Supreme Allied Commander Transformation, you have to deal with all domains, including cyber and space, and not just the maritime domain. But nonetheless, given your particular expertise in the maritime area, how do you see the importance of that role in NATO today? Do we need, for example, perhaps to invest more in that domain vis-a-vis the others? And if you don't mind, I know that one of the things that you're particularly focusing on at the moment, and it's very much in the news, is the protection of these underwater energy and telecommunications cables, which have been sabotaged in the Baltic recently, and where obviously NATO and the EU are trying to provide more protection. So could you say a little bit more about what your command can contribute to trying to sort of, ensure the security of all of this underwater infrastructure?
When you see in the DDA the analysis of the Russian threats, you have several sectors of confrontation, and 2/3 of these domains are maritime. there is a huge case for maritime issues. You spoke of the Black Sea. Even if the ships Ukraine had were sunk on the very first day of the war, in fact, Ukraine waged quite an efficient war against the Russian Navy, which is back in Azov Sea today. You see that the maritime dominance is always a question. And would the Ukraine not having done that, they would be struck by caliber missiles in depth in that territory from the sea, or they would have the pressure of amphibious operations. And so that was necessary for him to push back the Russian Navy. On the NATO perspective, take your map, go on Google, you see NATO AOR from the North Pole, and you will understand how it works. You will see this maritime aspect, and you will see why there was a sacklant in the past. So a part of the question, of course, is land, and so it's protecting all the borders that we have now with Russia, from Finland to Romania. But the maritime domain is important, and today the technology is bringing some new solutions with space, with drones, to have a better effect of monitoring and following what happens. And so you spoke about the critical infrastructures, and since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, you've seen the pipeline that has exploded, and you've seen several cases of undersea cables that have been cut. So this is kind of this gray zone ops. The gas pipeline is a big issue because it was the commerce between the West and Russia. But the cables in itself, you can repair it. So it's just a sort of psychological pressure. And so it brings disorder. It's a matter of days to be repaired. Some are redundant. In the Atlantic, for example, you have dozens of cables. So the idea of killing all the cables on the same time is not that credible, but it's a sort of constant harassment.
But you suggest in your Defence News interview that perhaps unmanned naval vessels, drone ships, could be the answer, and that NATO might be able to have this capability in the next few years that could help to at least monitor what's going on. You mentioned something, like having the same sort of monitoring at sea as you have with video cameras on our streets, monitoring traffic or whatever.
So the US have experienced, due to their Navy shortage in the Indian Ocean, they have experienced the TF Task Force 59 in the Gulf for nearly 1 decade. And so they have a great experience of this. And our contacts in the US, and it's a good point to be near of the Pentagon, of the G7, of this experience, is that it gives us good ideas. So at the time we are thinking about this, in the ministerial, there were discussions about critical infrastructure surveillance. And the Baltic is really a place where more surveillance will help.
Time for one final question, if you will indulge me. I mentioned at the beginning that you note you're not in Paris. You're now in Norfolk, Virginia, over on the other side of the Atlantic. Also, you have the new NATO Joint Forces Command, which to some degree brings a bit of the old SACLANT back into existence in the sense of an operational headquarters, as well as a strategic, your own headquarters in the United States for the defense of the Atlantic. I remember as an old NATO person myself, when ACT was established, and I worked with the Secretary General George Robertson at the time, his view very much was that it was good for NATO to have a footprint in the United States, but also at the time the impression was that all of the transformation was being done in the US, and NATO had to have something in the US so that Europeans can learn from American transformation. But this was some years ago. Is it really the case today that the Americans are doing all of transformation and Europe is sort of studying and copying? Or do you feel that transformation is something that the European allies, EU member states, also understand today? So it's more of a level playing field in terms of learning from each other. And then, if you may, and this honestly is my final question, because you've been very generous with your time and intellect today, is your command managing to keep to that original mission of keeping a very open dialogue and cooperation between the US and the Europeans in that area of forward planning, transformation, and so on?
First, I think it's the genius of the funders to have a strategic command on the US soil. I think it's very important because it brings the US in the islands, and they are a major contributor as a nuclear power. They really contribute to the credibility of the islands very deeply. On the tech side, just some figures. If you sum up the R&D budget of the 10 first tech companies in the US, it's around $180 billion a year. If you take the 10 first major defense companies in the US, they will, in R&D, spend $50 billion. Yeah. And the 10 first European companies is 10. Where goes the money? The genius scores. Yeah. And so whatever you want in the US, you will find more startups, more tech, more ideas, more trials, more failures too. Being there brings us a very useful sense of priorities. And so that helps Europe to say, hey guys, you should look at this. These are the good things to work on. And so not spend our money, we don't have so much, on bad things, but just on useful things. And so it's a big question for Europe today, and it was what I was arguing in Politico. Europe that will put more money on defense. They have no choice. In fact, they need to look at this money in a useful way. Today, the tech is dual. Most of the investment are both for civilian and for military, though it's not lost money. It's not just an insurance policy. You have feedback, you have employees, you have things that are useful for civilian side. I think it's a win-win party today to have this overlook coming from the USA. That are the things you should invest on. We see this, for example, on tech, on IT, on space, where absolutely European needs to jump in.
Well, Admiral Vandier, again, on behalf of all of the listeners of our Policy Voices podcast, and on my own behalf, thank you so much for, again, being our special guest today. It's been a real tour d'horizon and a tour de force as well on all of these big issues facing the alliance. At least I'm satisfied that we have the right man in the right place at the right time to handle it all. You certainly had the experience, but you've convinced me that you also have the vision. Good luck, Admiral, and thanks again for being our guest.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci à vous.
And that's it for today's show. Policy Voices will be taking a break for the holidays, but we'll be back again in the new year. Until then, happy holidays.